Hello and welcome to the Gen 10 Theater, and today we're going to skip over talking about how we can shove the Disney canon into the Legends material and talk about a set of books that came out back in the 90s that were once considered the original sequel trilogy. And why are we talking about it today? Well, it's because the Ahsoka show comes out pretty much exactly right now, and it's going to just pretty much throw these books out the window, so there's not really a better time than to find an out. So anyway, so these books, I'm going to start off by just giving my opinion on them as a whole, and then I'm going to say that there's going to be like a spoiler mark, and then going forward, then we're going to talk about some interesting things, how these affected further stories, even it affected Rebels, it affected all kinds of stuff going forward. So these books were by no means the first Star Wars books that came out. Now, when I said these were considered like the original trilogy, the sequel trilogy, really the way it worked was Heir to the Empire would have been Episode 7. Then for Episode 8, you had Dark Force Rising. And then for Episode 9, you would have had The Last Command. Now, for years, people kind of looked at them that way because it was the first and really following the original trilogy, it's the next in timeline order, set of books. Yeah, there was books that took place really before this, as far as like in between episode 6 and the first book here. In fact, I've talked about that one before. True Sabacca was really 24 hours after episode 6, but that came after this. So anyway, as I said, this is a great story. If you haven't ever read any of the Legends material, this is a great place for you to start. They're very exciting. The characters really feel like themselves. And, it's funny. I watched Rebels before reading these books, and then I went back to watch some more Rebels, and then I really realized that they dialed in Thrawn perfectly in that show. The way he felt in these books is exactly the personality he had in the show. So that's pretty much my recommendation. I 100% recommend these books to anybody who wants to get into the EU. Now, here's where the spoilers begin. I'm going to start off with light spoilers, and we're going to get into some really interesting stuff that takes place towards the end of the third book. Now, these books were the starting of referencing things that nobody has ever thought to reference before. George had to step in at some point and kind of guide Timothy Zahn. He had to tell him, maybe that's not what I was thinking for that sort of topic. Like, for example, the Sith. Timothy Zahn was trying to explain how Darth Vader was the Dark Lord of the Sith because it wasn't really explained so much in the original trilogy, so the author was like, okay, the Sith are going to be a race of beings. He was going to be the Lord over them. He was going to maybe save them, and they worshipped him and all that. Well, George kind of said, nah, we're not going to do that. The Sith is something else, but, go ahead with your idea, just change the name. So he changed it to I'm going to mess up all the names here, but the Nagri, I believe is how you pronounce it, and I always, in my mind, I kept calling it the Nigiri, which is the sushi. It's not that, but the Nagri are like some gray. They always say that they speak with a mew, which I guess they're kind of like dinosaurs, but they kind of have like a cat voice. I don't know. It's an interesting way to explain it, but they're apparently very good warriors, very strong. One of them even sends Chewbacca across the room with one attack. So you get the idea. They're really like powerful beings. Going forward, this is also the first time we hear about Mara Jade in the expanded universe. This is her starting point in everything. We also have the beginning that talks about like the Clone Wars and how it was carried out and how there's these cloning cylinders. And it kind of mentions that there was more than one way to clone. So this was supposed to be like a rival clone, which we never really got to see ever in anything else. But we thought it would have been interesting because these clones had a problem where you could grow them in 24 hours and they would just go insane. Their minds would be like you were copying a CD. Something like that, where you were just making duplicates, and it wasn't like the clones that we got from, Jango Fett, where each one kind of had a personality. These were done so quickly where there was something off about them, and Luke could detect that. So one of the things I really liked about these books is how much they got the personalities of the characters down correctly. You even had like the original set of characters going off on diplomatic missions, doing things that you would think they were going to do, things that we never really got so much in the Disney stuff. And you start to see that those Nagiri people are trying to capture Leia and Luke, but for the most part, they're trying to capture Leia. There was kind of a different plan to get Luke. And the reason they were trying to be captured was because of the guy here on the cover, and I'm going to say his name wrong as well, but Jorus Sao, as the best I can imagine how you say his name, Jorus Sao, or Kaboth. I think it would be Sao, it's C apostrophe both. So, however you want to say that. Basically, his background was he was a Jedi who was sent off on a mission into the furthest reaches of space to try to find civilizations outside the galaxy. Supposedly, he came back alive. Now, there is some weird things with dates in this book where what we really got was the Empire had been around for 19 years before A New Hope, and the Clone Wars was only a few years before that. This one kind of makes like everything happen 50 plus years prior. Like it adds like 15, 20 years onto the cycle. So pretty much this guy would be like 150 years old. And Thrawn's the one that finds him, and he's not convinced that, there's no way you're that old. Well, he quickly realizes, as does pretty much everybody, that he's actually a clone, and that he's insane because he was cloned in one of those cylinders that you can grow somebody in 24 hours. And clearly, it's not a very good cloning mechanism because it makes your mind go crazy. So he thinks that if he can capture Luke and Leia, and then eventually Mara Jade, because of course she also can use the Force, that if he gets them and Leia's children, because this is where the Solo twins, Jason and Gianna, were born, not in this book, I believe they were born in the third book, in the beginning of that one. And he's going to, create a galaxy of Jedi, dark Jedi, because there's no Sith. They were dark Jedi. And he's going to create them, and they're going to take over the galaxy. And it's because he thinks anybody who can't use the Force is a lesser being, and they can't think for themselves. He pretty much, he goes crazy. He's like an extreme version of the Emperor, but it's less focused on, like, he's not doing it for political means. This is more of he just doesn't like everybody else, and he wants everybody to either have the Force or you can just be annihilated. I don't care about you. So some of the other interesting stuff in here, there's more clones. They make clones. They find ships. They're like pumping out these clones to fuel and grow the Empire to make them humongous. And the Jorus Sao guy decides, well, I can also clone Jedi. So towards the end of the series, he decides he's going to make a clone of Luke, which their thing in this book is if it's a clone, you add a U, and suddenly it's a clone. So it's Luke, and Luke fights Luke, and Luke almost gets killed by Luke, but Luke dodges Luke's attack, and then Mara, of all people, actually kills Luke. if you can make sense of that. So you had Luke and Luke, but the funny thing is they actually have Luke with two U's using the original Anakin lightsaber, because they found the hand, they found the lightsaber, so here you go. And it's like some test. The funny thing is, because this is so early on in the EU, they kind of looked at the old movies and were like, they're just picking apart details and trying to take them far too literally. Like when the Emperor gets tossed down the shaft and there's a big fire, it's not because he fell into a reactor, it's because that's the dark side exploding out of you. So when Jorus Sao gets killed, he just bursts into a blue fire, which honestly I feel like that would have been interesting if every time they killed off a Sith that they just exploded into a blue fire. Could you imagine Obi-Wan does the flip over Darth Maul, he cuts him in half, and then poof, big blue fire, it melts the side of the building. Would have been interesting, but it's probably for the best that they kind of threw that out. So, yeah, it kind of goes back to the fact that even back into the EU, there were certain things that didn't fit in with itself later on. And ideas like that they were thrown out, especially when they made the prequel movies. Um, but yeah, it's funny. The Lords of the Sith, which became instead of the Sith, the Nagari, and then they go up to Leia and they're like, "You are Lady Vader," because they can smell the scent of Vader on her because she's related. And then Luke is son of Vader, and then Han is the consort of Lady Vader, or something like that. Whatever the word they use. Since we're already spoiling everything, the very ending. So the Nagari people pretty much were enslaved by the Empire for military purposes, and Leia kind of explains to them how they've been tricked, and the word gets out. So Thrawn has a Nagari bodyguard who's like this loyal, very sneaky, like he can slip in and out of shadows. And at the very end of the book, the word like comes out that Thrawn's pretty much assistant, Captain Paleon, sees on the screen that the Nagari people have revolted against the Empire, and he just kind of gets a look on his face, and then suddenly, the assistant Nagari, his name is Rook, just comes up and just slices everybody's throats and just runs off in a split second, and that's like, that's a fitting end to Thrawn, where he thinks he's all powerful. He's got all these clones. He's got his Nagari. He's got his grand empire, and then it just collapses. But it's a very very interesting set of books. The whole like starting point of Mara Jade, and the how it explains how she was one of the emperor's. Kind of makes that sound like he had multiple hands of the emperor, which was kind of like a secret apprentice of his that was in a way going to replace Vader, and he didn't trust Vader anymore, so he was sending her to find Luke, and how she was this close to getting Luke at Jabba's palace, and then of course he did the whole flip onto the diving board, and what happens from there. So yeah, I hope I rambled on not too much. That these books were very interesting, and if you haven't looked at them, it's a good time to look at them. If instead of watching the Ahsoka show, get an audiobook or something of these, and I know you won't be disappointed. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.